Hi, everyone. I am Gregory Q. Jenkins, the founder and CEO of Quintasia Studios, and this is the Quintasia Podcast. Today, our guest, I'm happy to have with us, and we're going to learn something about a place that I have never been, but definitely would love to travel to, and we're definitely going to learn a lot about our today's guest. And I think you will find her a fascinating individual, as I do. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome to our podcast, Ms. Cecile George. Welcome, Cecile.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you?
Good. Thank you for taking the time for appearing on our podcast today.
Absolutely.
So for those who may not be familiar with you, you are a writer, and tell us a little bit about your journey as to how so you can also, this is like part introduction and also how you came to settle on this profession of writing and what draws you to it.
Well, long story, as short as possible, in the interest of time, I was born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago, which is right at the very bottom south of the Caribbean. And when I was growing up, my dad was an old school film lover, so he used to show those 16 millimeter films but it was always about the cowboys, racing to the defense of the settlers and beating up the Indians and that sort of thing. So that was what first got me into loving film. And then back then, our TV station, we were a fairly newly independent country. And so we had our first TV station, and a lot of it was a lot of mix of things. We had local TV, we had TV shows, we had Australian TV shows, British TV shows, American TV shows, and on Sundays they would run old movies like Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton and the Marx Brothers and stuff like that. So I loved all of that. I thought it was fantastic. It was never really considered a profession, at least for me. I dabbled in a bit of writing at school, and I was always told that I was a good writer, but I didn't really pursue it until I got to university. I went to Howard, and then I did the communications major and started getting back into it a bit more. And then I started off in the film school there, and I started focusing on screenwriting because I realized that a lot of the stories that I was seeing while I loved them and I enjoyed them thoroughly, they didn't reflect my world, my perspective. And the one or two films that did come out of the Caribbean from those times were nice, but they didn't really hold a whole lot of interest, and they didn't get very widely distributed. So it was difficult to see them. And that is still, unfortunately, the case, although you now have a lot more options. So I decided, well, be the change that you wish to see in the world. And so I started writing on my own when I moved to New York and took a few writing classes and just kept writing, churning out scripts. And this is the first one that I really felt, well, no, there was another one that I did in New York called Dollar Van. It was about the dollar van drivers in Brooklyn and Bronx and that sort of thing. And that got a little traction, but never came through. And then I started doing, I just kept at it on and off. Life got in the way, but now I'm back seriously doing it again.
Well, I just learned something. I didn't know that you went to Howard. That had to be quite the experience as well.
Um, I actually went to Howard because I had two sisters there at Howard Med. And my father was like, oh, well, yes, you're next. We were always encouraged to go to university. That was my parents' big thing because they never had the privilege. And so they wanted to make sure that all their children did. And I was the last to be packed off. So yeah, and I went to Howard because that was where people who we already knew, like my sisters, were going to. So I simply joined them. It's a kind of I guess maybe a Caribbean thing. You go where your community kind of is. My sister went to Brooklyn College in New York because my dad's sister and her family had migrated to New York and lived in Brooklyn in the late 1960s, early 70s. So when she decided to go to uni, that was where she went because she lived with them and stayed with them and stuff. So they just sort of followed a pattern. And it was, I guess, a thing about, you're with family, you're with people if anything happens, you have somebody to rely on and that sort of thing. So it was great. Yeah.
It makes sense.
I mean, Howard is also a good school. So yes.
Yes.
Our first prime minister was the teacher at Howard, Eric Williams.
Well, there's a name Eric Williams. There's a name that must be familiar with. Well, I mean, that's interesting to know. I didn't know that, and that's something we share. My mother, in particular, she wanted to make sure that I went and go to Howard, but that was definitely, I guess, I was too much of I didn't have the right circumstances where I felt comfortable going far from home, so I stayed here in New York. Unlike you left your home country to
Island, yeah. Landed in, well, I went to New York first, landed in New York on the 21st of December. And it was an interesting experience because I came from, like 90 degrees and landed in 31. And the doors of JFK opened and I thought, oh, I've made a very large mistake. And that breeze hit me and my sisters were like, oh, you didn't bring a coat? I'm like, I live in a tropical country where the temperature never goes below 80 degrees. Why would I have a coat? I don't even know what a coat looks like. Because this was back in the, in the late 80s. So it was, it's a lot has changed. And now everybody, travels and they all have coats and boots and stuff like that. But I got up there in my sneakers and my one long sleeve shirt. So yeah, I was really not quite prepared for 32 Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
It was an unpleasant surprise.
I can imagine that would have been. Let me ask you, in terms of your writing, like, who would you say your influences are?
Well, because we've had such an eclectic background when I was growing up, as I said, I fell in love with all the old stuff, the Marx Brothers and the Harold Lloyds, all the silent movies. And then I was also a big fan of the Casablancas, the Epstein brothers, and Mankiewicz, and so forth. All the old school Hollywood writers that came up under the old studio system. And when I got to Howard, I was introduced to the African cinema, so Ben Ousmane, and I was actually taught by Haile Garima, a couple of his classes. So yeah, so I started, then that was when I started getting a slightly broader perspective, not just the American focused films. But I mean, I started falling in love with the European independent cinema, so the Danish writers, Thomas Vinterberg, and oh gosh, the lady's name escaped me right now. The person who did Babette's Feast. His name is on the tip of my tongue. But yeah, I started liking the old, I'm sorry, I liking those, although I do love, the big budget and that sort of thing. But I like films, smaller, quieter films that made you really think about culture and how people relate to each other. The big car crashes and all that stuff, with, planes flying off into the sunset and all that are great. But sometimes you just want to kick back and just watch something small and simple. And I decided to try to budget my films to small and simple.
Mhm. Now, you're doing a podcast
Yeah,
series on Woodbrook.
right.
So why don't you tell our audience what is Woodbrook and what made you do a podcast series about it?
Woodbrook is my neighborhood community that I was born and raised in. And it actually came about because it's a very interesting historical place. We have had a surprisingly outsized, I guess, influence or emphasis on the culture and politics and religion and so forth of Trinidad and Tobago, and the outside world as well. So the community was officially established in 1911, but before that it was a sugar plantation that was called Woodbrook, and before that it was part of a native village called Kumukarapo. So I decided to trace the history because back in 2011, the Woodbrook Residents Committee, of which I am a part, decided to start doing a book about the history of Woodbrook because they saw all the changes that were happening. It was being commercialized very quickly, and a lot of things were in danger of being lost. A lot of the historical information and the architecture and so forth, things were just being knocked down and turned into concrete buildings and that sort of thing. So it took a while to get the book going for various reasons. And so I came in on the back end of it. And when it was finally put out last year in 2022, I said, well, I am part of a Toastmasters group. And one of the projects was to do a podcast. And I thought, two birds, one stone. This should be simple. So yeah, I should have known better, but it's been an absolutely fascinating journey. It's a 15-episode podcast tracing the entire history of Woodbrook from its earliest days as a native village to down to the current. So I'm currently working on episode 10, and it has been a fascinating journey. I have learned so much about this place that I grew up in for the first 19 years of my life and did not know. So we've had the first prime minister of the country lived here. The first opposition minister of the country lived here. So it was the two doctors, Eric Williams and Dr. And again, the name just went straight out of my head.
That's right. It'll come back.
It'll come to me. This was a center, and it still is, of entertainment. So we had a lot of music groups who were here back in the 70s. We're still very much a center for Carnival. The parade actually happens right outside my front door, just up the street on the main thoroughfare, Arapita Avenue. There's a whole lot of eating places now. It's always been a place for food, to come to for food. And there are a whole lot of cultural activities. We've got we had about, I think, 4 or 5 steel bands were based here at one time back in the 50s and 60s. We had the Little Carib Dance Theater. We've had a whole set of music studios where young people who were in the community at the time trained to become musicians. So we've had an outsized influence on art and culture and politics and law. And even today, we have a lot of the most famous popular steel pan men like Ray Holman and Jonathan Chuckery. They live here. And we have some international folks, Maxine Williams, who is one of the head chief executives at Facebook. Her family's from here. So it's just, really incredible. You scratch the surface a little, and you might find somebody who was born in Woodbrook, lived in Woodbrook, or somehow associated with Woodbrook. So it's a really great community, and we're very anxiously trying to preserve the better aspects of it.
Now, where can people see these episodes of that you've created?
It's an audio podcast, so a video podcast would have just been way too much work. So it's an audio podcast. Right now, the first 5 episodes are on YouTube, which was a little confusing for me because I thought we're working with the National Trust of Trinidad and Tobago. The book came out under the auspices of the Woodbrook Residents Committee and the National Trust. So they uploaded it to a YouTube site. So it's all on. You just have to search "Growing Up Woodbrook," and you'll get 5 episodes. I just sent them the information to upload the 6th through 9th episodes. But what I am planning to do once I get a bit more time and some cash is to port everything over to an audio podcast platform so that people can access it better, because YouTube is really not the greatest platform for this particular sort of thing. But for right now, it works fine.
So tell me a little bit more about, I'm thinking about okay, full disclosure, I'm a foodie. I just, when I travel, I like to experience the different. For me, food is very much a way of remembrance for me. Like if I taste something, it evokes a memory. Like I remember the first time I had black bean soup. I was in Venezuela. I was in Caracas.
Oh, you were right next door.
Yes. So for me, anytime that I have, a very good black bean soup, it just takes me back to the first and only time that I've been to Caracas. And then, it was Venezuela was a lot more stable when I was there back in those days. So for you, what is it about the richness of the culture of Trinidad and Tobago that draws you in? And I know that you're not part of the tourism board, but if I'm a filmmaker, what would be your plug, to say, hey, here are some things that you could think about when you're looking for a shooting location?
Well, I won't argue with you about the food. I'm a foodie as well. And yes, I do enjoy a good plate of food. So if you are a foodie and your focus is food, please come down. We've got lots. And really good food. I think we boast of having the best food variety in the Caribbean. What we offer, well, it's a combination of various cultures. We got African, East Indian, Chinese, Portuguese, Middle Eastern. We have some Japanese and Koreans, and we've got pretty much almost everybody on the planet, plus our native populations we call the First Peoples. And so that has come together to create a very, really heady and interesting mix. So you find a Hindu temple right across from a mosque, right across from a Catholic church, that sort of thing, and everybody's just like, yeah, whatever. And they're also the native religions, because we had the African slaves and they brought their religions as well. So you've got the Orisha and the Yara people and that sort of thing. So it's a really interesting population mix. And plus the islands themselves, I should say, are both extremely beautiful. You got some mountains that are not too high, so they are negotiable. And then some beautiful beaches, especially in Tobago. it's a pretty well developed country, so that there's a lot of accessibility. You can get around fairly easily if you need to, when you need to. There's the Pitch Lake down south. There are the beaches, there are mud volcanoes that do a little exploding sometimes. There are coffee plantations and cocoa plantations and sugar plantations and all sorts of native artifacts that are still being discovered and worked on. So it's a country that if you have to think about coming to somewhere in the Caribbean, it's well worth a look. Plus, we have one of the best rebate systems in the world. I think it's between 35 and 50% rebate if you shoot in Trinidad. So it's always nice to get money back when you shoot a film, and we do very well with that. So yeah, there are a whole lot of incentives to come.
Yeah, I definitely don't mind, getting money back. So you'll never hear me complain. Plus, you get good food on top of that, and
yes.
good vista to go with it. I don't think it can ask for anything more than that. So in terms of, I guess my last question that I'll ask you is, how do you, when you think about the future, what role would you like to play with your writing? And I hope you understand where I'm going with this question. What is the impact that you would like to have with your work?
I would like to do a lot more films, as many as possible. This first one that I'm trying to get off the ground is getting some very good traction and everybody loves it. And I'm just hoping that it will be the one to get out there. And I have several more coming down the pike. But what we really are trying to do down here is establish a proper industry. As I said, we were heavily under the American umbrella. So the local television, and we never really got our local programming up to a level, unfortunately, that it could compete. So they're now trying to work on that. So I was actually at a seminar yesterday with a Nigerian filmmaker and agent who had some very good things to say about Trinidad, and it was a very positive experience. So what we are hoping to do is, and I am hoping to be a part of, is that emergence of film and television that has a local focus, a Caribbean focus. We would like to, the same way that you can tell an American movie from a British movie, from a Japanese movie, from a Chinese movie. We are trying to see how we can develop a sort of a Caribbean aesthetic. How do we tell stories? What do our stories involve? What do they look like? And that's something that we as a collective are working on. And I particularly have been trying to figure out that for myself, so that when I shoot this film, I'll come to it from a slightly better perspective. And 5-10 years down the road, we're hoping that we will have a serious industry here to attract foreign films, but also building up our young people so that they have a better sense of their own culture, their own history, and the things that they can accomplish by being fluent and learning how to appreciate their own ability to tell stories, their own stories, and what those stories have to tell the rest of the world, essentially.
Well, I humbly submit that if you are going to be a part of bringing that industry to life in Trinidad, then I like their chances.
Well, thank you very much. I hope so. It's a pleasure. There's so much talent down here. I mean, it's incredible. You listen to what people are talking about and what they're trying to do. And, our main problem is funding and distribution, because the population is only 1.4, 1.5 million. And film is a very difficult, concept for most people to grasp, because it's not like making widgets. You don't just make a widget for $2, put a little markup on it, or sell for $5, and then you make your profit. That's not how it works. And so it's not something that people really understand. And so it has the education process and all of that stuff is what we're doing now. And so that takes some time. But yeah, the young kids are being drawn to it. We have an animation school that is churning out some really incredible work. And there are people actually all over the place. We have folks in Hollywood and actors and directors and producers. We've got folks in England, a couple of them in, I think, Australia. So there's talent to draw upon, and it's actually a really exciting time to be here. So I'm looking forward to the next 5 years.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time, for sitting down with me and having this conversation. I hope that my audience, they learned a little bit about you. And as I've told people before on some of the other guests that I've had, and also some more disclosure. So Cecile and I are in the same writers group. That's how I met her. And I had Brooklyn and John on an earlier podcast, and now I have you. And I thank you for taking the time. I thank you for telling us about Trinidad and Tobago and sharing your stories with us. And I hope to be hearing much more, and I'm sure I will be, because I think you're a wonderful storyteller. And I would say, ladies and gentlemen, this is another name that you should remember, because I predict you will be hearing it again in the not too distant future. So thank you, Ms. Cecile George, for stopping by. I want to thank everybody once again. And I will say to you, you have been listening to the Quintasia podcast or watching the Quintasia podcast. And I'll say bye-bye for now.
Thank you, guys. Much appreciated.